When Amy Winehouse's death was officially recorded, the focus moved quickly away from the details of that night. The narrative was simple, contained, acceptable. She had been alone. There were no signs of struggle, no suspicious circumstances. Most people stopped reading after that. But inside the official paperwork, buried beneath medical language and procedural summaries, there was another layer of information. Not emotional, not speculative, technical, logs, timestamps, system behavior. These details were never meant for the public. They were created to document routine processes, device handling, evidence intake, basic digital checks. On paper, they appeared neutral, objective, forgettable, until they were a line. Because when investigators later reconstructed the digital trail surrounding Amy Winehouse's final night, something stood out immediately. Not a sound, not a voice, not even a recording, a reaction. Multiple systems, independent of one another, responded to the same window of time in ways they were not designed to do. And the most important reaction did not involve sound at all. It involved deletion. At exactly 3:17 a.m., a file that had never been acknowledged in any public report was removed from a device inside Amy's home. The deletion was logged automatically without a user command. No button press, no manual confirmation, no recorded intent. The system made the decision on its own. This matters because deletion protocols are conservative by design. They exist to protect data, not erase it. Especially in devices configured for passive recording or background buffering, files are preserved by default. Something had overridden that behavior. To understand why, investigators had to step back. Not to the moment of death, but to what happened immediately after the first anomalies were discovered. When the house was secured and devices were collected, standard digital preservation rules were followed. Phones were powered down. Memory states were documented. No active deletions were permitted after intake. And yet, when the internal logs were reviewed days later, one entry appeared out of sequence, a deletion timestamp that predated the intake process. 3:17 a.m., hours before anyone entered the house, hours before evidence handling began, hours before the device should have been altered at all. This meant one thing: whatever caused the deletion happened while Amy Winehouse was still inside the house, and the system had decided not to keep what it recorded. At first, this was dismissed as a routine cleanup function, the kind that removes corrupted or incomplete files to preserve storage integrity. But when engineers examined the conditions required to trigger such a cleanup, the explanation fell apart. The file did not meet deletion criteria. It wasn't oversized, it wasn't duplicated, it wasn't flagged as invalid by the operating system. In fact, according to the log structure, the file had been fully indexed before it was erased. The system had seen it, recognized it, and then removed it anyway. That sequence, index, register, delete, is not normal behavior. It suggests evaluation, and evaluation suggests context. This raised a question that was never addressed publicly. What did the system register in the minutes before 3:17 a.m. that made it decide the file should not exist? To answer that, investigators began tracing the behavior backward, minute by minute, through the night's digital footprint. Not listening to audio, not reviewing video, simply observing how devices behaved when nothing was supposed to be happening. What they found was a pattern of instability, subtle but consistent, beginning shortly after midnight. Sensors fluctuated. Idle states were interrupted. Background processes activated without clear triggers. Nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms, but enough to indicate that the environment the systems were monitoring had changed. Not violently, not suddenly, but enough to matter. And the closer they moved toward 3:17 a.m., the more deliberate those reactions became. The system wasn't failing, it was responding. Amy Winehouse's Camden Square home was not technologically complex in an obvious way. There was no dedicated control room, no professional surveillance hub, no studio-grade monitoring system. What existed instead was something far more common and far more deceptive. A layered collection of ordinary consumer devices, each designed to operate independently, each quietly observing a different aspect of the environment. Together, they formed an unintended network. Phones, security cameras, motion sensors, environmental monitors, background recording buffers. None of these systems were meant to communicate with one another. They did not share memory. They did not share triggers. They did not even share the same manufacturers. Which is why what happened that night stands out, because independent systems do not normally react in alignment. Inside the house, at least 4 distinct categories of monitoring were active during the early hours of July 23rd. First, there were visual systems, exterior CCTV cameras positioned to monitor entrances and the immediate perimeter. These systems were motion-based, recording only when activity crossed predefined thresholds. They showed nothing unusual after Amy returned home. Second, there were access systems, door locks, and entry sensors that logged opening, closing, and tampering events. These logs showed no unauthorized entry, no forced access, no anomalies. Third, there were environmental systems, devices that passively track temperature, air pressure, and background electromagnetic fluctuation. These systems were not designed for security. Their purpose was comfort and diagnostics. And finally, there were audio-capable systems, phones, speakers, and buffer-based recording components that intermittently captured sound for calibration or error handling. Each category worked in isolation. Under normal circumstances, a disturbance would appear in one system first. A door opens, a camera triggers, a sound is recorded. The sequence would be logical, directional, explainable. That is not what happened. What investigators noticed during forensic reconstruction was not a single trigger, but a sequence of partial activations, small reactions spread across systems that should not have reacted together at all. Between midnight and 3:17 a.m., the house did not register a clear event. It registered something worse: ambiguity. Environmental sensors showed minor pressure changes without corresponding temperature shifts. Audio buffers briefly activated without capturing sustained sound. Motion detection thresholds were approached but not crossed. The systems behaved as if something was present, but not enough of anything to classify it. This kind of behavior is rare, but it is documented in one specific context: proximity without interaction. When something moves through a space without touching surfaces, without opening doors, without producing sharp sound, systems struggle. They react inconsistently. They hesitate, and hesitation leaves traces. One engineer later described it as a room being occupied by something that doesn't know how to be in a room. This description was never written into any report, but it explained what the data suggested. The most important system, however, was not designed to detect presence at all. It was designed to clean up after errors. The phone inside the house, the same device that had already produced unexplained audio fragments earlier that night, maintained a background recording buffer. This buffer constantly captured short snippets of ambient sound, overwriting itself unless an event required preservation. It was a safety net, a fallback. If a system error occurred, the buffer would lock and save the last segment of audio for diagnostic purposes. This buffer was not user accessible. It did not appear in normal storage, and it was not meant to delete files on its own. Yet shortly before 3:17 a.m., that is exactly what it did. The buffer attempted to preserve something, then it erased it. When engineers later examined the deletion logic, they found no evidence of corruption severe enough to justify removal. In fact, the system had enough integrity to index the file before deletion, which raised an uncomfortable conclusion. The system had captured data that triggered a response sequence it was never programmed to handle. And when that happens, systems default to protection, not of the user, of themselves. Deletion in this context is not failure, it is containment. This reframed the entire event. The question was no longer whether something unusual had been recorded, it was whether the system had recognized something it could not safely store. When investigators compared the phone's behavior to the environmental logs, a troubling alignment emerged. The fluctuations in pressure and electromagnetic noise peaked in the same narrow window that preceded the deletion. Not enough to be dramatic, not enough to alert a human, but enough to confuse machines. Machines require consistency. They classify the world through thresholds. Something in that room crossed threshold in fragments, just enough to be noticed, never enough to be understood. And when the systems failed to classify it, one of them chose to erase the record entirely. This behavior was not mirrored anywhere else in the device's history. No other night, no other location, no other circumstance, which meant the cause was not the phone, it was the environment. And the environment that night did not behave like an empty room. By the time investigators understood that a deletion had occurred, the file itself was already gone. What remained was not sound, not content, not even corruption in the usual sense. What remained was a trace. Every digital file, no matter how briefly it exists, leaves behind a structure, a header, an index entry, a timestamp. These fragments are created before any meaningful data is written. They exist to tell the system what the file is supposed to become. At 3:17 a.m., such a structure was created inside Amy Winehouse's phone. The system prepared to store audio. This step alone was significant because the phone did not enter recording mode at 3:17 a.m. There was no user interaction, no button press, no active application. The system initiated the process internally. That meant something had triggered the pre-recording state. A threshold crossed quietly, without sound, loud enough to be classified as noise, without movement, sharp enough to register as handling, just enough presence to wake the buffer. The file header was generated. The indexing system assigned it a temporary identifier. Memory space was allocated. Then, before any usable audio data could be committed, the process stopped. The file was evaluated, and the system made a decision. Deletion. This was not a crash, not a power failure, not a storage overflow. The deletion was logged as intentional. That distinction mattered, because unintentional deletions leave chaos behind. Broken references, orphaned memory, fragmented indices. None of that was present here. The system cleaned up after itself, which suggested it believed it was handling an abnormal condition. When forensic specialists later attempted to recover the file, they encountered something unusual. Normally, deleted audio leaves residual data, talks, fragments that can be reconstructed partially, even if the file itself is gone. In this case, there was nothing. No residual waveform, no compression artifacts, no ghost data. It was as if the recording had been removed before it could exist. This led investigators to examine the exact timing of the deletion sequence. The file creation began at 3:17:02 a.m. The deletion was completed by 3:17:04 a.m., 2 seconds. In that window, the system evaluated the incoming signal and decided it should not be preserved. 2 seconds is not enough time for meaningful audio capture, but it is enough time for detection. The system had sensed something. It just didn't allow it to stay. To understand why, engineers compared the event to other instances where phones autonomously delete files. Almost all involved one of three conditions: severe corruption, security threats, sensor conflict. The first was ruled out immediately. The second had no supporting indicators. The third, however, remained unresolved. Sensor conflict occurs when a device receives simultaneous signals that cannot coexist logically. When audio input, environmental data, and internal state contradict one another, systems default to containment. They stop recording. They erase. They protect integrity. In simple terms, the phone encountered a situation where its inputs did not agree on what reality looked like. Something was present, but not consistently enough to define. Something crossed thresholds, but not in ways the system could reconcile. And so the system did the only thing it could. It removed the record. When investigators cross-referenced the 3:17 a.m. deletion with other data, the alignment became impossible to ignore. Environmental sensors showed a brief stabilization immediately after the deletion, as if whatever disturbance had been present was no longer detectable. Audio buffers went quiet. Pressure readings normalized. Background electromagnetic noise returned to baseline. The room, from a system perspective, returned to being empty. This sequence raised a question no one was willing to answer publicly. Did the system delete the file because it malfunctioned? Or did it delete the file because whatever triggered it left? There was no evidence that the deletion caused the calm, but there was evidence that the calm followed the deletion. And that inversion disturbed everyone who reviewed the logs, because it suggested that the system's reaction marked the end of the anomaly, not the beginning, which meant the file was not deleted to clean up after an event. It was deleted as the event was ending. The phone had not failed. It had reacted, and whatever it reacted to had moved on. In most investigations, time is treated as a straight line. Events follow one another. Actions cause reactions. Records align with reality. In Amy Winehouse's case, that assumption quietly collapsed. When investigators attempted to reconstruct the final hours using digital evidence, they discovered that the problem was not missing time. It was compressed time. Moments that should have been spread across hours appeared folded into narrow windows. System reactions that normally require clear triggers clustered together, overlapping in ways that defied ordinary sequencing. The night did not behave like a timeline. It behaved like a pressure point. Between midnight and 3:17 a.m., the systems inside the house recorded activity that could not be cleanly ordered. Some logs appeared to respond before their triggers. Others reacted after conditions had already normalized. This is known in technical forensics as temporal inconsistency. It happens when multiple systems attempt to interpret the same environment using different clocks, thresholds, and reference points, and fail to agree. Normally, one system anchors the timeline: a call, a door opening, a camera activation. Here, none did. Instead, investigators found clusters of micro-events, small reactions compressed into short spans with no dominant cause. At the center of this compression was 3:17 a.m., not because it marked the end of the night, but because it marked the point where all systems briefly aligned. Environmental sensors stabilized, audio buffers cleared, background processes returned to idle. For a fraction of a minute, the house became readable again. This alignment allowed investigators to treat everything before 3:17 a.m. as a single disturbed phase, not a sequence of separate incidents, but one prolonged anomaly perceived differently by different systems. In other words, the night did not contain multiple unexplained events, it contained one event stretched across time. This reframing changed everything. If the anomaly was continuous, then the deletion at 3:17 a.m. was not an isolated decision. It was a boundary, a line between two states. Before 3:17 a.m., systems struggled to interpret their environment. After 3:17 a.m., they no longer needed to. The compression effect also explained another inconsistency that had troubled investigators: the mismatch between estimated time of death and system activity. Medical assessments placed Amy's death within a broad window that overlapped the disturbed phase. But the systems behaved as if the environment changed abruptly, not gradually, at a specific moment. This suggested that the anomaly did not intensify over time. It ended, which raised a question that could not be addressed without speculation. What happened at 3:17 a.m. that caused multiple independent systems to regain coherence at once? No physical action was recorded at that moment. No sound spike, no movement, no entry or exit. And yet, the systems reacted as though something fundamental had shifted. Some investigators propose a mundane explanation: power stabilization, background interference resolving, software processes resetting. But these explanations fail to account for the synchronization. Independent systems do not reset together without a shared cause. Others suggested that the compression itself was an illusion, a product of overanalysis. But when the logs were viewed side by side, the pattern was unmistakable. The night collapsed inward around that one timestamp. It was as if the systems had been waiting, not for an action, but for absence. The timeline, once linear, folded around a moment when the environment returned to something machines could understand. And that moment was 3:17 a.m. Once the system stopped reacting, the investigation moved back into human hands. This was the moment where uncertainty met procedure. From that point on, nothing unusual happened because the night had become understandable again. The house behaved like a house. Devices behaved like devices. Time resumed its normal shape. What followed were decisions, reasonable, professional, and quietly decisive. The first decision was scope. Investigators chose to treat the case as a closed environment event. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no external threat. That classification immediately narrowed the questions that were allowed to be asked. If there was no external cause, then internal anomalies became secondary. The second decision was relevance. Digital artifacts that did not clearly contribute to cause of death were categorized as non-essential. Audio buffers, environmental fluctuations, and system reactions were considered peripheral unless they demonstrated direct harm. They did not, at least not in a way that could be proven. The third decision was risk. Unexplainable technical behavior introduces doubt, not just about what happened, but about the competence of those reporting it. In high-profile cases, doubt spreads faster than facts, so investigators lean toward clarity: clear cause, clear timeline, clear conclusion. Details that complicated that clarity were not erased. They were simply deprioritized, filed, archived, left unexplored. This was not negligence, it was triage. Every investigation balances completeness against resolution, and in this case, resolution mattered. There were no grounds to suggest criminal involvement, no evidence that a different outcome could have been prevented, no actionable conclusion to pursue. From a human perspective, continuing to analyze ambiguous system behavior would not change the result, so they stopped. The file deletion at 3:17 a.m. was acknowledged internally, then set aside. The timeline compression was noted. then explained away as analytical overlap. The synchronized system reactions were considered coincidental. Each decision made sense on its own. Together, they formed a boundary around what the investigation would and would not become. One investigator later described it privately as closing the door without locking it. The information remained inside, but no one was expected to return. The official report reflected this approach. The language was careful, measured, complete. It answered the questions the public asked. It did not pursue the questions the systems raised. And that distinction mattered, because once the investigation concluded, the digital artifacts lost their urgency. Devices were returned or decommissioned. Logs were stored according to retention policies. Temporary data expired. No one was tasked with revisiting the deletion. No one was assigned to reconstruct the buffer behavior. No one was instructed to ask why multiple independent systems had reacted to the same narrow window of time. Those questions required intention, and intention had shifted elsewhere. Years later, when independent analysts examined what little data remained, they noticed something subtle about the decisions made that night. Every choice favored normality. Every explanation leaned toward the familiar, not because the unfamiliar was impossible, but because it was unusable. Human systems, like technical ones, require boundaries. When something crosses thresholds without providing context, it becomes difficult to process. And difficult things are often set aside. The investigation did not deny the anomalies. It simply moved past them. And in doing so, it left behind a record of human judgment, layered on top of machine reaction. Two systems responding to the same event in very different ways. The machines tried to contain it. The humans tried to conclude it. Neither fully succeeded. A record does not need to exist in order to be lost. This is the first principle investigators had to accept. The 3:17 a.m. file was not recovered. It was not archived. It was not preserved in any playable form. And yet, it remained central to the case. Because loss in digital forensics is not defined by absence of content, but by evidence of removal. When a file is created, systems make room for it. They reserve space. They assign identifiers. They prepare paths. Even when the file is deleted immediately, those preparations leave behind a void, and that void can be measured. Inside Amy Winehouse's phone, the deletion at 3:17 a.m. left such a gap, a space in the file table that did not correspond to any known process, a missing link in the sequence of internal identifiers. This gap could not be filled by later activity. No other file claimed the space. No overwrite occurred. No normal cleanup followed. It remained empty. For forensic analysts, this is significant. Systems are efficient, they reuse space, they optimize, they do not leave holes unless something prevents them from doing so. The 3:17 a.m. deletion created a hole that the system treated as untouchable, which suggested that whatever occupied that space was not simply removed. It was quarantined. The file system behaved as if it had encountered a boundary it was not allowed to cross again. This behavior is rare, but it is documented in cases involving internal conflict states, moments when a system encounters data that violates its own assumptions about stability. In those cases, the system does not merely delete, it isolates. It marks the region as unsafe, and it avoids it. When analysts mapped the phone's storage behavior before and after the event, they found a clear pattern. The device functioned normally until 3:17 a.m. Afterward, certain background processes were subtly altered. Cleanup routines skipped regions they would normally reclaim. Indexing path adjusted to route around the missing entry. The phone adapted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. This adaptation raised a troubling implication. The system did not consider the deletion a success. It considered it a compromise, which meant the record was not simply gone, it was unfinished. The lost record, in this sense, was not the audio itself, but the moment when the system failed to fully resolve what it had encountered. That unresolved state persisted, and it shaped everything that followed. When investigators attempted to extract residual data from the surrounding memory blocks, they found no fragments of sound. But they did find something else. Timing artifacts, small discrepancies in clock alignment, micro delays in buffer flushing, irregularities in how quickly the system resumed idle. These artifacts clustered around the same missing region. The system did not forget the file. It remembered where it had been, and it avoided it. This is why the 3:17 a.m. file is still referred to, internally, as a lost record. Not because it contains a secret message, not because it proves anything extraordinary, but because its absence cannot be reconciled with normal system behavior. It left a shape behind, and that shape refuses to disappear. In most cases, lost recordings are the result of negligence, failure, or time. A tape erased, a file overwritten, a disk corrupted. This was different. The system made an active choice, and then it carried the consequence of that choice forward. Which brings us to the most unsettling realization. The lost record was not destroyed to protect the user. It was destroyed to protect the system. And whatever it encountered at 3:17 a.m. was significant enough to alter how that system behaved ever after. Once the existence of the deletion was confirmed, investigators faced a more difficult task than listening to audio or reviewing logs. They had to explain behavior, not what the system recorded, but how it decided to act. Digital systems do not make assumptions. They follow rules. Every deletion, every overwrite, every cleanup process is governed by logic that can be traced, audited, and reproduced. At least that is the expectation. In the case of the 3:17 a.m. file, no such reproduction was possible. Engineers began by isolating the deletion protocol responsible for the action. The function was designed to remove incomplete files only under specific conditions: severe corruption, write failure, or security violation. None applied. The file had not failed to write. There was no evidence of memory error. No security flags were raised. The protocol should never have executed. To test this, identical devices were configured with the same firmware version, storage capacity, and background settings. Engineers attempted to recreate the sequence by forcing interruptions, introducing noise, and simulating environmental instability. Nothing matched. In every test scenario, the system either preserved partial data or failed in a noisy, traceable way. It never created a file, indexed it, and then removed it cleanly. That sequence required intent. Not human intent, but internal resolution. The second theory was software error. Glitches happen, buffers misbehave, processes collide, but glitches leave fingerprints. They create fragmentation, they misalign timestamps, they produce cascading faults. The 3:17 a.m. deletion did none of these things. It was contained, precise, isolated, which eliminated random failure. The third theory focused on sensor conflict. Modern devices do not rely on a single input. Audio capture is influenced by multiple concurrent streams: microphone input, accelerometer data, electromagnetic noise, power stability, and clock synchronization. If these inputs contradict one another strongly enough, the system can enter a protective state. This theory came closest to explaining the behavior. But even here, something was wrong. Sensor conflicts typically result in aborted recordings, not deletions. The system stops listening. It does not erase the evidence that listening occurred. In this case, the system went further. It removed the trace of the attempt itself, which suggested the conflict was not transient. It was unresolved. When engineers examined the deletion timing against sensor readings, a narrow overlap emerged. For a fraction of a second, multiple inputs spiked just enough to exceed thresholds, but not enough to classify. Audio detected presence, motion detected proximity, power detected fluctuation. None of them could confirm a cause. This created a paradox inside the system. Something was happening, but nothing could agree on what. When that happens, systems default to integrity preservation. They erase ambiguity. The deletion, then, was not a reaction to sound. It was a reaction to inconsistency. This reframing mattered because it meant the system was not responding to noise, movement, or corruption. It was responding to a situation it could not reconcile with its model of reality. And systems, like investigations, do not tolerate unresolved states. One engineer summarized it simply: the system encountered something it could sense but not define. This statement was never formalized. It could not be, because defining it would require acknowledging a category of input that does not exist in documentation. The technical analysis concluded with no definitive cause. Not because analysis failed, but because every plausible explanation stopped just short of the observed behavior. The deletion remained technically unjustified. And in digital forensics, unjustified actions are not dismissed. They are remembered. Once the technical analysis reached its limits, investigators were left with interpretation, not speculation, not belief, explanation. Every unexplained event generates two kinds of answers: the ones that can be tested and the ones that cannot. In the case of the 3:17 a.m. deletion, both existed and neither fully satisfied the evidence. The first set of explanations was rational. The most common theory pointed to software instability, background processes misfiring, a rare edge case in the operating system, a flaw triggered by environmental interference. This explanation had one advantage: it required no additional assumptions, but it failed under scrutiny. Software errors leave patterns. They repeat under similar conditions. They appear in update histories and bug reports. The deletion sequence observed at 3:17 a.m. had no documented precedent, no comparable cases, no matching failure reports. Another rational explanation focused on electromagnetic interference. Nearby devices, power grid fluctuations, or radio frequency anomalies can disrupt sensors and confuse recording buffers. Yet interference of that kind affects systems broadly and noisily. It does not isolate itself to a single file. It does not cleanly index and remove data. And it does not leave the surrounding environment unchanged. The systems inside the house did not behave as if they were overwhelmed. They behaved as if they were unsure. A third explanation involved human interaction: accidental contact, sleep movement, an object brushing the device, something mundane, unnoticed, and easily forgotten. But this explanation contradicted the logs. No accelerometer spikes, no touch registration, no corresponding motion data. The phone did not register handling. It registered proximity. And proximity without contact is not enough to trigger deletion protocols. These rational explanations accounted for pieces of the event, but never the whole, which is why some investigators reluctantly acknowledge a second category of explanations, not as conclusions, but as possibilities. These explanations were darker, not because they implied something supernatural, but because they involved unknowns. One such theory suggested that the system responded to a physical presence that did not interact with the environment in conventional ways. Something that displaced air, altered electromagnetic conditions, and triggered sensors inconsistently. This explanation did not violate physics, it violated expectations. There was also the possibility of a rare convergence, multiple minor disturbances aligning by chance, a coincidence so precise it mimicked intention. But coincidence does not adapt. The system did. After 3:17 a.m., the phone behaved differently. Cleanup routines avoided the missing region. Buffer thresholds adjusted. Something had changed. Coincidence does not leave memory. Finally, there was an explanation no one wrote down, but everyone understood. That some events do not fit into the categories we use to explain them. Not because they are impossible, but because they fall between definitions. The investigators did not choose one explanation over another. They chose containment. They accepted that the event could not be resolved with certainty, and they allowed the official narrative to move forward without it. In doing so, they preserved clarity but lost completeness. The competing explanations remain exactly that, competing, none disproven, none confirmed, all circling the same absence. The 3:17 a.m. file did not survive to tell its story, but the system's reaction to it did, and that reaction remains unexplained. When the investigation officially ended, the assumption was that the systems inside the house returned to normal. They did not. Nothing dramatic happened. No alarms, no visible failures. What changed was subtler. In the weeks following the event, technicians reviewing archive device behavior noticed small but consistent deviations in how certain systems behaved. Not enough to be flagged, not enough to demand intervention, but enough to suggest adaptation. The phone that had deleted the 3:17 a.m. file showed altered background behavior. Buffer activation thresholds were marginally higher. Cleanup routines executed less frequently. Some diagnostic checks were skipped entirely, not disabled, avoided. The device behaved as if it had learned something. This kind of behavior is unusual but not impossible. Systems adjust when they encounter edge cases. They optimize around failures. They reroute processes to prevent repetition. But optimization requires a model of what went wrong. And that model was never defined, which meant the system adapted without understanding. Other devices showed similar, though weaker, traces. Environmental sensors exhibited reduced sensitivity during overnight hours. Motion thresholds drifted slightly upward. Logging intervals became more conservative. Individually, these changes could be explained away. Collectively, they formed a pattern. The house became quieter to machines, less reactive, less curious, as if something had taught the systems that reacting carried risk. Years later, when independent analysts were allowed limited access to anonymized data from similar cases, comparisons were made. The behavior observed in Amy Winehouse's devices did not match standard post-incident profiles. In cases involving power surges, devices become more cautious. In cases involving corruption, they become more redundant. In cases involving interference, they become noisier. This case fit none of those categories. Instead, the systems behaved as if they had encountered a condition they could not classify, and chose to minimize engagement with similar conditions in the future. This raises a difficult question. Can a system remember something it cannot define? Technically, no, but behaviorally, yes. Avoidance is a form of memory. The data echoes did not prove that something extraordinary had occurred. They did not point to a cause. They did not reveal content. What they revealed was consequence. Whatever happened at 3:17 a.m. did not end when the file was deleted. It left behind a behavioral imprint, and that imprint persisted. When engineers attempted to fully reset the devices years later, those adaptations vanished. Factory settings erased the cautious behavior. The systems returned to baseline, which meant the change had not been permanent. It had been learned, and learning implies experience. This realization unsettled some analysts more than the deletion itself. A missing file can be dismissed. An unexplained reaction can be rationalized. But a system that modifies its behavior based on an unresolved event challenges the assumption that machines are passive observers. They are not. They interpret, they adjust, they remember, in their own way. The echoes in the data did not tell investigators what happened. They told them that whatever happened mattered, and that mattered long after the night itself had passed. In the end, the case of the 3:17 a.m. recording was never closed in the way most investigations are. There was no final answer, no definitive cause, no recovered evidence that could settle the question. What remained was structure. The systems behaved in a way that could be traced but not justified. The deletion occurred in a way that could be logged but not reproduced. The environment returned to normal but only after the anomaly ended. Nothing in the data directly contradicted the official conclusion, and yet nothing fully supported it either. This is where the case becomes difficult to resolve, not because it invites speculation, but because it resists certainty. The first Amy Winehouse documentary asked a simple question: was she truly alone that night? The second examination does not answer that question. Instead, it reframes it, because the systems inside the house behaved as if something was present. Not necessarily a person, not necessarily a threat, but something that disrupted their understanding of the environment. They reacted without identifying. They recorded without capturing. They deleted without explanation. And then they adapted. The unresolved element is not the content of the lost recording. It is the reason the system decided it should not exist. No technical report explains why a device would index a file, evaluate it, and erase it cleanly within seconds, unless the system believed preservation was more dangerous than loss. That belief was never documented, it was never challenged, and it was never overturned. Years later, the data still refuses to align neatly with the narrative that closed the case. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The deletion sits in the logs like a parenthesis that was never closed. Everything before it leads inward. Everything after it moves on. And the moment itself remains isolated, a boundary between two states of normality. If the systems had failed, they would have left chaos. If the systems had been corrupted, they would have left damage. They did neither. They acted with restraint, which suggests intention. Not human intention, but systemic judgment. The question then is not what the recording contained. It is what the system recognized and why it chose silence. Because silence in this case was not the absence of information, it was the final response.